Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to present the article named Neuroscience Behind Simultaneous Interpreting. I'm going to be the one presenting, also with Sofia Carpio and Araiza. Simultaneous interpreting is considered as one of the most challenging linguistic aspects. The interpreter has to listen to a speech in a language, retain it in his brain, process the meaning, and produce a message in another language with fluency. All this happening while receiving new information. So we can say that the interpreter's brain is doing different tasks at the same time in real time. Traditionally, this process has been studied through psycholinguistic. Studies used to focus on different tasks as, for example, auditory speech processing, word recognition, syntactic parsing, meaning assembly, and semantic anticipation. Additionally, investigators really focused on memory because for a long time they thought that interpreters possess a very incredible memory. They thought it's because of the interpreter's capacity to retain message and ideas compared to the capacity of anyone who is not an interpreter. Between 1970 and 1980, different cognitive models were developed to understand how the interpreters could do different tasks at the same time. But they didn't really know what was happening in the interpreter's brain. The first brain imaging study was done in Finland in the 2000. It was about a positron emission tomography to understand and observe the activity of the brain in real life. The subjects of the study were interpreters that use shadowing and also the process of interpreting from one language to another in simultaneous interpreting. When they interpret into their mother tongue, the inferior frontal gyrus was activated. However, when interpreters interpret into English, they use their left inferior temporal lobe related to word finding process and also the cerebellum that was related to the perfectionist of action patterns. In other words, their brain work harder. After this study, several other researchers started to studying this process in professional interpreters. However, there were no new investigations about neural imaging until recent times. team did a research in 2014 related to this topic. They used functional magnetic resonance imaging to understand and observe the brain of different, specifically novice interpreters. The results shown that simultaneous interpreting activates a very wide neural basis. They detected activity in the basal ganglia that is used to process complex actions. Following with this presentation, I'm going to talk about two main points: the role of basal ganglia and the interpretation of results. These aspects help us to understand why interpretation is not only a linguistic activity, but a complex cognitive process. Let's start by the role of basal ganglia. These structures of the brain have a main role in simultaneous interpreting. When we think about basal ganglia, we relate them to the movement. But this article shows that they go beyond that. They're also related to the executing of certain tasks and learning. This is very interesting when we relate that to what an interpreter does in the booth. Let's imagine that we're interpreting a speech in real time. In just seconds, we must decide which word we should use and even which technique should we use. We don't have time to stop and think. The speaker is the one who sets the rhythm, and the interpreter must adapt. In this part, basal ganglia is very important because allows interpreters to make fast decisions. Basal ganglia is linked to the motivation and decision making, two main aspects to keep up during an interpretation. They allow us to focus for a lot of time and make fast decisions. The article also mentions that diseases like Parkinson and Tourette's affect directly the basal ganglia. It's not only related to involuntary movements, but also affect the cognitive capacities. This shows that the basal ganglia are structures that participate in our movement and our cognitive process. Regarding simultaneous interpreting, those findings are very relevant. This research proves that the role of basal ganglia is very important. Simultaneous interpreting is not only related to language, but to parts of the brain that allow the interpreter to keep up with the speech. We can say that the activation of the basal ganglia is clear evidence of how important is control when interpreting? We're talking about decision making and content. Let's talk about the interpretation of the findings. The article explains that simultaneous interpreting depends on cognitive control. This is not only related to linguistic traditional regions. What happens when interpreting is much more complex because it's related to the connection of different brain systems at the same time. To achieve a good interpreting, the interpreter must have a really good control of the semantic lexic systems. What does this mean? Well, the interpreter must understand the meaning and reformulate it into the target language. We must do this through a speech that is not only grammatically correct, but also content correct. All these in just a few seconds with no pauses and with fluency.